My mother raised her glass before 120 guests, introducing me not as her daughter, but as someone who makes things unnecessarily stressful. The room laughed. My brother handed me a white envelope, expecting my signature on his wedding gift. They never knew the house deed bore my name, and a transaction freeze sat in my purse. He thought I came alone, missing the Marine rising from the bride's table, followed by 19 others. My name is Addison Perry. For nearly 12 months, I had maintained a carefully measured distance from my family. A silent perimeter built on the unspoken agreement that we functioned better apart. Yet, here I was, driving down a Spanish moss-draped avenue toward a luxury coastal resort in Beaufort, South Carolina. I had not agreed to return because the icy chasm between us had miraculously thawed. I was here because my mother, Marianne Perry, had called me precisely 14 days ago, her voice tight with that familiar, manicured anxiety. She had insisted that the entire family had to look absolutely flawless for the in-laws. The Mercer family was not just wealthy, they were a legacy military family, steeped in tradition and social gravity. Marianne needed her complete set of props, and unfortunately for my peace of mind, I was the final, reluctant piece of the diorama. The moment my tires crunched against the crushed oyster shell driveway of the resort, the illusion of being a cherished guest vanished. I did not even make it to the reception desk before the demands began. There was no warm embrace, no motherly inquiry about my drive down from Arlington. Instead, I was instantly demoted to the role of an unpaid logistics coordinator. Within 30 minutes of my arrival, I was handed a clipboard. I found myself verifying seating charts, alphabetizing silver-plated name tags, and negotiating with a near-hysterical florist who had delivered white hydrangeas instead of the rare orchids my mother had aggressively specified. It was muscle memory. As a former Marine logistics captain, managing chaotic supply chains and soothing panicked personnel was encoded into my DNA. I am currently the Director of Contract Integrity at Blackwell Meridian Systems, a job that requires a forensic eye for detail and a zero-tolerance policy for inefficiency. My family knew this. They did not respect the rank or the career, but they were infinitely eager to weaponize my competence when it suited them. They assumed that because I was strong, because I could handle anything, I required zero emotional reciprocity. I was standing in the cavernous ballroom, quietly instructing the wedding planner on how to reroute the catering staff to avoid a bottleneck near the champagne tower. When my brother made his entrance, Parker Perry strolled into the room with the careless grace of a man who had never paid the tab for a single one of his own mistakes. He was dressed in a tailored linen suit that probably cost a small fortune, looking every inch the golden boy my parents had engineered him to be. He stopped in front of a massive floral arch, adjusting his cuffs with a practiced, cinematic flick of his wrists. He caught sight of me holding a walkie-talkie and a stack of vendor invoices. A slow, easy grin spread across his face. "Addie," Parker said, his tone dripping with an arrogant sort of affection. "Always the best at cleaning up messes. Glad you finally have a chance to put those skills to good use this weekend. The planner was about to have a nervous breakdown before you stepped in." I looked at him, feeling the familiar, dull ache of being entirely unseen by the people who shared my blood. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not say he was glad to see his sister. He only acknowledged my utility. I offered a flat, non-committal nod, handing the invoices back to the planner without a word. Seeking a moment of quiet, I stepped out into the grand lobby. The hallway was transformed into a shrine dedicated entirely to Parker and his bride, Lydia Mercer. Dozens of pre-wedding photographs hung from suspended silver wires. There were pictures of Parker and Lydia laughing on a sailboat, posing elegantly at a black-tie gala, and staring deeply into each other's eyes on a pristine beach. There were several large, meticulously framed portraits of the Perry family, my mother, my father, and Parker, looking like a catalog advertisement for generational wealth. I scanned the gallery wall from left to right. Out of perhaps 40 photographs, my face appeared exactly 0 times. I had been completely excised from the visual history of the family, erased from the narrative they were presenting to the Mercer dynasty. I was the ghost in the machine, essential for the operation, but invisible to the audience. I swallowed the dry taste of rejection, telling myself I did not care. I had work to do. A stack of heavy wooden welcome boxes, each filled with artisanal soaps and expensive miniature bottles of bourbon, needed to be moved to the bridal suite. Naturally, no one from the resort staff was available, and Parker was too busy being photographed, so I picked up the boxes myself. The path to the service elevator took me past a private cigar terrace lined with heavy oak doors. One of the doors was slightly ajar, letting a sliver of warm, amber light spill out onto the hallway carpet. As I walked past, adjusting the heavy boxes in my arms, I heard my father's voice. Douglas Perry possessed a booming, authoritative baritone that he usually reserved for intimidating golf caddies and junior financial advisors. But right now, his voice was hushed, clipped, and laced with an urgent, nervous energy. "The paperwork is in motion," my father was saying. "Just keep the escrow agent on standby for Monday morning. After tonight, the house will be securely in the kids' names." I stopped. My combat boots made no sound on the thick wool runner. I held my breath, the wooden edges of the welcome boxes digging sharply into my forearms. Another male voice, smoother and distinctly unfamiliar, replied, "I understand, Douglas, but the title company needs absolute certainty. No encumbrances. No last-minute disputes from any other parties." "There will not be any disputes," my father snapped back, the velvet dropping entirely from his tone. "Everything is perfectly contained. As long as Addison does not make a scene." The boxes suddenly felt 100 pounds heavier. My heart performed a slow, sickening drop in my chest. As long as Addison does not make a scene. The air in the hallway seemed to freeze. My mind raced, filing through the fragmented pieces of information. The house. What house? My parents lived in a sprawling colonial in Virginia, and Parker currently rented a high-rise loft he could barely afford, subsidized heavily by the bank of Mom and Dad. I had never heard a single whisper about my family gifting a house to Parker and Lydia. And more importantly, why would giving Parker a house have absolutely anything to do with me making a scene? A cold, deeply ingrained instinct from my years in military intelligence flared to life. When people speak about you as a variable that needs to be managed, you are no longer family. You are a liability in a compromised operation. I did not linger to hear the rest of the conversation. I carried the boxes up to the suite, my movements mechanical, my mind running complex threat assessment algorithms. I needed to look my mother in the eye. I found Marianne Perry in the solarium, sipping a glass of Prosecco while critiquing the posture of a hired cellist. She wore a silk dress the color of crushed pearls, every strand of her hair locked into immovable perfection. I walked up to her, my posture rigidly straight, channeling the exact demeanor I used when questioning a defaulting defense contractor. "Mother," I said, keeping my voice low and entirely devoid of inflection, "I just heard Dad talking to someone on the terrace. He mentioned a house being put in Parker's name. What house is he talking about?" Marianne did not flinch. She did not spill a single drop of her drink. She slowly turned her head, her eyes sweeping over me with a mixture of mild annoyance and polite condescension. She took a tiny, deliberate sip of her Prosecco. "Addison, really," she sighed, the corners of her mouth twitching upward into a paper-thin, entirely bloodless smile. "You are always so tense. You do not need to know absolutely everything on your brother's special day. We are handling the details. All you need to do is smile, mingle with the groomsmen, and try not to look so militant." She patted my arm, a gesture that felt more like a warning strike than a motherly caress, and glided away toward the cellist. I stood alone in the center of the solarium, the sun setting outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the marble floor. The pieces were locking into place with terrifying clarity. This weekend was a facade. The white lace, the imported orchids, the overflowing champagne, the carefully curated photo gallery. It was all a beautifully constructed theatrical distraction. Right then, on the very first night of the festivities, the truth settled into my bones like winter frost. This was not a wedding. It was a stage. My family was not gathering to celebrate love. They were frantically trying to execute a massive, hidden transaction. And whatever they were doing, whatever they were stealing to buy Parker his perfect life, they were banking on my lifelong habit of silent, stoic endurance to get away with it. They thought they had invited the reliable, quiet daughter who always cleaned up their messes. They had no idea they had just summoned a storm. For the past 15 years, I had functioned as the ultimate low-maintenance asset in the Perry family portfolio. I was the child who required zero parental bandwidth, a self-sustaining machine that ran quietly in the background while all the resources were frantically pumped into my brother. At 18 years of age, I sat alone at the kitchen counter and filled out my own federal financial aid applications. I researched, applied for, and secured a full military reserve officer training scholarship without a single word of guidance. I walked into a recruiter's office, swore an oath to the United States Marine Corps, and packed my own duffel bags for training. When my active duty service concluded, I did not return to my childhood bedroom. Instead, I lived frugally, saved every possible dollar of my captain's pay, and closed on a brick townhouse in Alexandria using a veteran loan. I built an airtight, formidable career at Blackwell Meridian Systems, relying entirely on my own unyielding grit. I was the textbook definition of the strong, independent daughter. And in my family, that strength was my greatest curse. Parker, by staggering contrast, was our parents' magnum opus. He was an ongoing, deeply funded emotional renovation project. While I was running obstacle courses at dawn and learning how to manage supply chains in hostile territories, Parker was being endlessly pampered. He drifted aimlessly through 4 years of college, cycling through 3 different liberal arts majors before settling on something vague involving media studies. After graduation, he did not get a job. He had phases. He burned through hundreds of thousands of dollars of our parents' money on a series of disastrous vanity ventures. He launched a luxury experiential branding agency that secured exactly 0 clients. He tried importing artisan spirits. He spent 6 months developing an application for bespoke pet wellness. Every single time one of his limited liability companies dissolved into a pile of debt, my father would quietly cover the losses, and my mother would soothe him. They told their friends that Parker was simply a visionary, an artist who was bravely taking the time to find his true path in life. The Perry family did not operate with open, explosive hostility. They did not scream, throw plates, or deal invisible bruises. Their abuse was far more sophisticated, a masterclass in modern American upper-middle-class neglect. They treated me with a sanitized, suffocating, polite cruelty. It was a dynamic built entirely on the ironclad assumption that I simply did not need anything. Empathy, affection, and grace were strictly finite resources in our household, and my brother held an absolute, undisputed monopoly on all of them. Every sacrifice I ever made was written off as an inherent character trait, a biological quirk of mine that required neither recognition nor gratitude. If I worked 90 hours a week, it was just Addison being intense. If I missed a family Thanksgiving because I was deployed in a combat zone, it was just Addison doing what she liked to do. Conversely, every single one of Parker's relentless demands, every tantrum, every financial failure, was classified as an emotional sensitivity that had to be fiercely protected by the family unit. I distinctly recall a brief window of leave I took after returning from a particularly grueling 9-month overseas deployment. I was sitting at the granite kitchen island, staring down at a mug of black coffee, trying desperately to recalibrate my nervous system to the overwhelming, peaceful quiet of suburban Virginia. My mother was standing by the refrigerator, talking on the telephone with a fellow country club board member. I sat perfectly still and listened as she described Parker's latest failure, a disastrous attempt at writing screenplays, as evidence of his deep, beautiful, tortured soul. Then, the conversation shifted to me. My mother let out a high, tinkling laugh. She told her friend that the military was the absolute perfect place for me. She spoke about me as if I were a reliable piece of farm machinery. She said I never really required warmth or comfort, just a rigid set of procedures to follow. To my own mother. My resilience was not a virtue forged in hardship. It was a convenient lack of humanity. I was built to endure, which neatly absolved my parents of any moral obligation to nurture me. When I finally took off the uniform and transitioned into the corporate sector, their narrative regarding my personality only hardened. I became a director specializing in contract integrity and financial fraud. My daily life involved hunting down missing corporate funds, auditing phantom supply chains, and tearing apart the elegant, expensive lies of multinational defense contractors. My parents found my career thoroughly distasteful. It lacked the glossy prestige they valued. They whispered to their social circle that I was a cold, calculating woman. They claimed I preferred the silent, clinical company of legal files, bank statements, and tax records to actual human beings. They could not possibly understand that tracing the undeniable truth in a sea of corporate deception was the only way I knew how to make the chaotic world make sense. Numbers did not lie. Contracts did not play favorites. Now, we were all gathered under the Spanish moss for Parker. He was marrying Lydia Mercer, and this union was the most important campaign my parents had ever waged. The Mercer family was not just wealthy in the way my parents were. They possessed a distinctly American kind of royalty. They were military aristocracy, a bloodline forged in generations of stars earned on uniforms and legacy admissions to elite war colleges. Lydia's father was a highly decorated colonel. Her grandfather had been a general. They commanded rooms with a quiet, terrifying authority, entirely unbothered by the desperate, new money anxiety that plagued my mother and father. To the Perry family, this marriage was not merely a celebration of two people falling in love. It was a desperately coveted leap up the social class ladder. It was a strategic acquisition, a merger that had to be fiercely protected against any internal flaws or public embarrassments. Standing in the opulent lobby of the coastal resort, watching the floral designers hang thousands of imported orchids, the reality of my presence here settled heavily into my chest. I felt it with a bone-deep, humiliating certainty. My family had not invited me back into the fold because they missed the sound of my voice. They had not reached out because a year of estrangement had broken their hearts. I was summoned because my absence would prompt uncomfortable questions from the aristocratic Mercers. A missing sister implies a fractured, dysfunctional family, and the Perrys had to present a flawless, unified, traditional front to secure their ascension into this new social stratosphere. I was nothing more than a heavily starched, deeply necessary prop. They needed my physical body in the background of their wedding photographs to provide a symmetrical illusion of a happy, supportive home. Yet, my mind kept drifting back to the hushed, frantic tone my father had used on the cigar terrace. My analytical brain, trained to detect anomalies in massive volumes of data, began to hum with a dark, creeping suspicion. This weekend was not just terrifyingly expensive, it was a structural impossibility. A wedding of this magnitude, complete with custom architectural lighting, a 5-course rehearsal dinner, and a waterfront reception for over 100 guests, required a staggering hemorrhage of capital. Combine that with my father's secret phone call about putting a house into Parker's name, and the financial math simply did not align with reality. My father had been complaining about severe market downturns and liquidity issues for the past 2 years. I looked around at the towering floral arrangements, the crystal champagne flutes, and the velvet lounge furniture rented specifically for the cocktail hour. I realized that this perfectly curated, breathtakingly lavish weekend was built on a foundation of hidden ledgers. This level of theatrical perfection did not just cost money. It was constructed using resources that had to be pulled from somewhere else. The polite cruelty of my family had always relied heavily on my absolute willingness to absorb their debts, whether those debts were emotional or logistical. As I watched my brother laugh with a group of groomsmen, handing out expensive cigars he definitely did not pay for, a cold knot formed in my stomach. I was beginning to suspect that this time, the price my parents were extracting from me to fund Parker's perfect life was not just my silent endurance, it was something physical. It was something they thought I would never have the audacity to defend. 14 days before I found myself playing the glorified event coordinator on the Carolina coast, I was sitting alone in the quiet sanctuary of my Arlington kitchen. It was past 11 o'clock at night. The only illumination came from the harsh blue glare of my laptop screen and the amber streetlights filtering through the blinds. I had just finished reviewing a dense, 400-page procurement contract for work when a notification chimed. It was an automated email from a premium title monitoring service. I had subscribed to the service out of an abundance of professional caution a few years ago when I purchased my townhouse. In my line of work, you see how easily assets can be manipulated, how swiftly someone's financial foundation can be ripped out from under them with a few forged keystrokes. When the subject line read that a new public record had been filed against a property in my name, my initial thought was that it was a bureaucratic glitch, a misfiled tax document, a clerical error in the county clerk's office. I clicked the secure link, authenticated my identity, and downloaded the encrypted file. The property address at the top of the scanned document was not my residence in Virginia. It was a waterfront cottage located in Moorhead Sound, North Carolina. My chest tightened. The property was a modest but incredibly valuable piece of coastal real estate left behind by my maternal grandmother. It had been placed into a generation-skipping trust, designed to be split exactly 50-50 between Parker and me. For years, the cottage had sat quietly in the background of our lives, managed by a local property firm, accumulating value. I had not thought about the legal mechanics of it in a very long time, mostly because I foolishly believed the ironclad language of a trust was sacred. I scrolled down to the second page of the PDF. There, resting at the bottom of a newly executed loan agreement, was a digital rendering of my signature. I stared at the black ink on the glowing screen. I had not signed this document. I had not been to North Carolina in over 4 years. I leaned closer, my eyes scanning the dense, agonizingly small print of the notary section. The notarization had occurred precisely 3 weeks prior in my parents' home county. Beneath my forged signature was a clause citing the legal authority used to execute the document. It was a special power of attorney. The air in my kitchen turned to ice. I knew exactly what that document was. 60 months ago, right before a high-risk deployment to the Middle East, I sat in a sterile legal office on a military base and signed a comprehensive power of attorney. It was a standard, grim necessity for deployment. If my convoy hit an improvised explosive device, if I ended up in a burn unit at Walter Reed, or if I came home draped in a flag, my parents needed the legal authority to manage my bank accounts, handle my taxes, and settle my estate. It was an instrument of absolute trust, designed for the absolute worst-case scenario. I had survived the deployment. I came home, unpacked my gear, and integrated back into civilian life. But in my profound naivety, I had never filed the paperwork to officially revoke that specific authorization. I had assumed that parents do not strip mine the assets of their living, breathing children. According to the digitized county records unfolding on my screen, my parents had walked into a regional bank holding that outdated piece of paper. Acting as my legal proxies, they had bypassed the standard protections of the trust and leveraged the entirety of the Moorhead Sound cottage. They had taken out a massive home equity line of credit against the property. They had essentially mortgaged my inheritance. My training took over. The shock was immediately compartmentalized, locked away in a dark corner of my mind, replaced by the cold, calculating machinery of a fraud investigator. I needed to see where the capital had flowed. I accessed the attached addendums, which included the disbursement authorizations. The bank had released a staggering sum of cash. I began tracing the routing numbers and the listed beneficiaries of the wire transfers. The first transfer, a heavy 6-figure sum, went directly to the luxury resort in Beaufort, the venue for Parker's wedding. My eyes darted across the screen, reading the subsequent line items. $25,000 wired to an elite floral design studio, $15,000 transferred to a 12-piece brass and string ensemble. Another massive payment went to a boutique cinematic videography firm. There was even a significant wire sent to a high-end interior staging company, a vendor strictly utilized to furnish empty homes to look perfectly lived in for magazine spreads or grand reveals. Every single exorbitant detail of my brother's impending nuptials was meticulously itemized on this ledger. The imported orchids, the velvet lounge furniture, the vintage champagne, it was all being financed by the stolen equity of my property. I was unwittingly underwriting the most important social event of my parents' lives. But the financial parasitism was not the final blow. The most devastating piece of evidence was buried at the very end of the digital packet. It was an unexecuted quitclaim deed. The document was completely drafted, missing only the final wet ink signatures and a notary stamp. The language of the deed was brutally straightforward. It outlined the absolute transfer of the Moorhead Sound cottage from the family trust directly into the names of Parker Perry and Lydia Mercer, classified as joint tenants with the right of survivorship. The transfer was listed as a gift of equity. My name was entirely absent from the new ownership structure. They were not merely draining the value of the home to pay for a party. They were actively preparing to hand the physical property over to the newlyweds as a grandiose wedding gift. They were going to stand in front of the aristocratic Mercer family, hand Parker the keys to a waterfront estate, and cement their status as wealthy, generous benefactors. And once that deed was filed with the county clerk on the Monday morning following the wedding, untangling the fraud would become an apocalyptic legal nightmare, potentially destroying Lydia's title to her own wedding present. I sat back in my chair. The digital clock on my oven read 2 a.m. The silence in my townhouse was absolute. If I were the daughter my parents believed me to be, I would have picked up my phone right then. I would have called my mother, my voice shaking with betrayal, begging for an explanation. I would have allowed them to gaslight me, to weave a complex narrative about temporary cash flow issues and promises of future repayment that would never materialize. I would have let them manage my anger until I quietly submitted for the sake of family harmony. But as I stared at the irrefutable, black and white evidence of their theft, I felt no urge to cry. I felt an intense, hyper-focused clarity. In my profession, I hunt down corporate embezzlers and shell company architects. I know intimately how white-collar criminals operate. When perpetrators are absolutely convinced that their victim is entirely passive, when they believe their target will never have the spine to audit the ledger, they get incredibly arrogant. They leave massive, sloppy, undeniable trails of evidence. My parents had left a digital highway leading directly back to their own greed. I did not reach for my phone. Instead, I reached for a fresh ream of printer paper and loaded it into the tray of my laser printer. I hit the print command. The machine hummed to life, churning out page after page of undeniable proof. The loan origination documents, the forged proxy signatures, the wire transfer receipts mapping exactly how my stolen equity was converted into wedding flowers and rehearsal dinners. The unexecuted quitclaim deed that was designed to erase me from the family legacy completely. I pulled a bright yellow highlighter from my desk drawer. I sat at my kitchen island until the sun began to rise over the Potomac River, methodically highlighting every timestamp, every fraudulent authorization, and every routing number. I built a comprehensive, airtight dossier. My parents had constructed a beautiful, expensive stage for this wedding. They had invited 120 high society guests to watch their golden boy take his vows. They had assumed I would simply show up, manage the logistics, and play the role of the silent, accommodating sister. As I slid the thick stack of highlighted documents into a heavy manila folder, I made a vow of my own. I was going to attend this wedding. I was going to smile for the cameras and ensure the catering staff stayed on schedule. But I would never, ever be their compliant victim again. At precisely 8 o'clock the morning after my discovery, I walked into the Alexandria office of Naomi Voss. Naomi was a formidable real estate attorney who had meticulously guided me through the closing of my townhouse several years prior. She possessed the warmth of a tactical scalpel and the analytical mind of a forensic accountant. I did not bother with pleasantries. I simply placed the thick manila folder of highlighted documents on her glass conference table and asked her to dissect the anatomy of the fraud my parents had just committed. Naomi poured 2 cups of black coffee, sat down, and began to read. For 45 minutes, The only sound in the room was the sharp turning of paper. When she finally looked up, her expression was a mask of professional disgust. She confirmed my worst suspicions. The power of attorney I had signed before my combat deployment was sweeping, but it was bound by the fundamental legal doctrine of fiduciary duty. A proxy is legally obligated to act in the absolute best interest of the principal. Naomi pointed a manicured finger at the loan origination signatures. By leveraging my half of the coastal trust to secure a line of credit that exclusively benefited themselves and my brother, my parents had engaged in egregious self-dealing. They had crossed the line from poor family dynamics straight into actionable financial crime. But Naomi was thorough. While I sat across from her, she logged into a proprietary legal database and began pulling the extended digital footprint of the county filings. In a stroke of supreme arrogance and administrative negligence, the mortgage broker had attached an entire thread of preliminary email correspondence to the final county submission packet, effectively making their private plotting a matter of public record. Reading those emails was like watching a surgical autopsy of my family's morality. Every new file Naomi opened delivered a fresh, precise cut. We uncovered frantic messages between my father, Douglas, and the broker, dated 3 months ago. The tone was desperate. My father admitted that Parker's luxury branding company had not just failed, it was drowning in severe, unmanageable debt. Parker had depleted his operating capital, defaulted on several high-interest business loans, and was facing potential litigation from unpaid vendors. Then came the emails detailing the Mercer family's involvement. The in-laws were old-money military aristocrats who did not simply marry off their daughters blindly. They had subtly requested assurances of Parker's financial stability. To prevent the Mercers from discovering that their future son-in-law was entirely insolvent, my parents concocted a magnificent lie. They promised the Mercers that, immediately following the wedding vows, the young couple would be granted the deeds to a historic waterfront cottage as a traditional family wedding gift. It was a desperate maneuver to manufacture a solid financial foundation for Parker out of thin air, using the stolen equity of my inheritance as the building material. As sickening as the financial theft was, the psychological warfare buried in the documents was infinitely worse. Because I had already been assigned the role of unpaid logistics coordinator for the wedding, I had demanded access to the wedding planner's digital portal earlier that week under the guise of verifying vendor arrival times. Sitting in Naomi's office, I pulled up the planner's communication logs on my laptop, cross-referencing the dates with the mortgage approval. There, in a private messaging thread between my mother and the lead coordinator, I found the blueprint for my character assassination. My mother had written detailed instructions on how to manage me during the wedding weekend. The message read that if Addison reacts poorly to any surprises regarding the family property, the coordinator must immediately isolate her from the guests. My mother explicitly instructed the staff not to let anyone hear my complaints, claiming that I had a history of making things unnecessarily difficult. She warned the planner that I was a rigid, difficult woman who tended to turn every minor disagreement into a battlefield. I stared at the screen, the blood rushing in my ears. They were not merely stealing my property. They had actively prepared the battleground to neutralize my reaction. They knew I would eventually find out about the deed transfer. Their strategy was to preemptively smear me as a bitter, unstable, and hopelessly combative spinster. If I dared to stand up and scream that I was being robbed, my family had already planted the seeds to ensure the aristocratic crowd would view me as a hysterical, jealous sister trying to ruin a beautiful day. They were weaponizing my military discipline against me, twisting my stoicism into a narrative of cold, unfeminine aggression. But the final, most devastating piece of evidence did not come from my parents. It came from Parker. Buried at the very bottom of the mortgage broker's forwarded email chain was a message Parker had sent to my father, reassuring him about the risk of the fraudulent loan. Naomi read the sentence aloud, her voice tight with disbelief. My brother had written that they did not need to worry about me blowing the whistle. He stated clearly that she will not ruin it. Addison lives by principles, and her principle is to always save face for the family. I closed my eyes. The betrayal settled into the deepest part of my chest, cold and heavy. Parker was not some oblivious golden child passively receiving a gift. He was a fully conscious, active participant in my exploitation. He knew exactly what my parents were doing to the trust. He knew I was being robbed to cover his catastrophic failures. But he had confidently calculated that my personal code of honor, my deep-seated desire to protect the family name from public humiliation, would force me to swallow the theft in silence. He was banking on my integrity to facilitate his fraud. Naomi closed her laptop and folded her hands on the desk. She looked at me with the intense, focused energy of a litigator ready for war. She offered a simple, brutal, and highly effective legal solution. She told me she could draft an emergency injunction and file it with the courts by noon. We could instantly freeze the property transaction, lock down the equity line of credit, and serve my parents with a cease and desist order before they even packed their bags for South Carolina. We could drag them into a closed-door mediation room and dismantle their scheme quietly, efficiently, and with devastating legal force. I looked down at the stack of highlighted papers. I thought about the massive, opulent stage my family was currently building on the coast. I thought about the 120 guests, the imported flowers, the crystal glasses, and the carefully crafted lie my parents were preparing to sell to the Mercer dynasty. If I stopped the transaction right now, in the quiet privacy of a law office, my parents would simply adapt. They would pivot the narrative. They would tell the Mercers that I was legally abusive, that I was trying to extort them, that I was a tragic, broken veteran trying to destroy my brother's happiness. They would forever play the victims of my supposed cruelty. I looked up at Naomi. I told her to draft the freeze order, but to keep it securely in her desk drawer, I strictly forbade her from filing anything or contacting my family. Naomi raised an eyebrow, questioning my logic. I explained that I was not going to stop them from building their perfect, expensive theater. I was going to let them put on their lavish costumes, dim the lights, and gather their high society audience. I wanted them to feel the absolute thrill of victory, and then, at the exact moment they thought they had won, I was going to detonate the truth right in the middle of their stage. The rehearsal dinner took place on a sweeping flagstone terrace overlooking the Sound. The evening air was thick with coastal humidity and the scent of roasted oysters, mingling heavily with the expensive perfumes of the guests. I was stationed near the entrance, physically and symbolically removed from the clinking crystal and the rehearsed, effortless laughter of my family mingling with the aristocrats. My mother had decided, exactly 45 minutes before the first course was scheduled to be served, that the seating arrangement for the secondary tables was aesthetically displeasing. Consequently, I was standing alone behind a portable wooden podium, wrestling with a heavy leather binder and hastily rewriting 60 place cards by hand. As I peeled the backing off a fresh sheet of adhesive labels, the ambient noise of the cocktail hour seemed to shift. A shadow fell across the podium, blocking the warm amber light of the string bulbs overhead. I did not look up immediately. I assumed it was another waitstaff member needing direction, or perhaps my brother arriving to demand a fresher cocktail. Instead, a pair of highly polished dress shoes stopped just inches from my boots. I finally lifted my gaze. A man stood there, observing me with a quiet, intense focus. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a sharply tailored dark blue suit that could not entirely hide the dense, coiled muscle underneath. He possessed that unmistakable, rigid posture, the kind of physical bearing that is drilled into your bones during basic training and never truly leaves your architecture. It was not the dismissive, impatient look I had been receiving from every other guest all weekend. It was a look of profound, almost bewildered recognition. I racked my brain, scanning my memory for the face, when he suddenly spoke. "Captain Perry?" The title hit the humid air like a physical blow. Nobody had addressed me by that rank in years. Certainly nobody in this hyper-curated, civilian zip code. I blinked, the context rapidly snapping into sharp focus, the strong jaw, the assessing eyes, the subtle scars. This was Mason Mercer, Lydia's older brother. He was an infantry marine. More importantly, He had been a lieutenant attached to a forward operating base during a particularly chaotic and brutal theater of operations overseas. His unit had been pinned down in a remote valley, completely cut off from conventional supply routes by severe weather and hostile interference. It had been my logistical command that bypassed the standard bureaucratic protocols, rerouted 3 transport helicopters through a storm, and kept his men supplied with ammunition and medical rations for 10 agonizing days. We had never formally met face to face. We had only exchanged terse, static-filled radio transmissions and heavily encrypted situation reports. But you do not forget the voice on the other end of the radio when it is the only thing keeping your unit from being erased. I instinctively straightened my spine, dropping the pen onto the podium. "It has been a very long time since anyone used that rank," I said, keeping my voice low and even. "I am a civilian now, just Addison." Mason did not offer a polite, social smile. His eyes flicked down to the heavy leather binder, the stack of half-written name tags, and the frantic, handwritten seating chart. He then looked across the crowded terrace, watching my mother holding court near the bar, a glass of wine in her hand, completely ignoring my existence while I performed the duties of a hired assistant. He looked back at me, his jaw tightening imperceptibly. He possessed the sharp situational awareness of a seasoned combat officer, and it took him exactly 5 seconds to read the tactical environment of the terrace. He saw the complete disconnect between the woman who had orchestrated impossible supply drops under heavy fire and the woman currently being treated like an indentured servant by her own blood. "What exactly are you doing over here in the dark?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral, but laden with a heavy, dangerous subtext. "Ensuring the event runs smoothly," I replied, smoothly deflecting the inquiry. "Someone has to handle the friction." Before he could respond, my mother's voice cut sharply through the background chatter. She was standing 20 feet away, snapping her manicured fingers in my direction. "Addison! Stop chatting with the guests. The caterer needs the final dietary restriction list immediately. Do not dawdle." I felt a hot flush of humiliation creep up the back of my neck, but I kept my face entirely impassive, locking my emotions behind a steel door. I gathered the paperwork. Mason did not move out of my way. He watched my mother turn her back. Then he looked directly into my eyes. He did not offer pity. He did not ask invasive questions about my dysfunctional family dynamic. He simply held my gaze and delivered a statement that carried the weight of absolute conviction. "If anyone in this room does not know who you are," Mason said quietly, his voice vibrating with a quiet, fierce intensity, "that is their problem, not yours." He gave me a single, crisp nod, a gesture of profound, silent respect, and stepped aside to let me pass. For the rest of the evening, I functioned on autopilot, navigating the catering staff and mitigating minor disasters, but my awareness had shifted permanently. I began to truly observe the Mercer side of the guest list. My family had been so blinded by the old money prestige of Lydia's lineage that they had completely overlooked the practical reality of her background. The Mercers were a legacy military family. That meant their inner circle, the people occupying the prime tables near the head of the terrace, were not just wealthy socialites and country club members. I watched them. I noted the way they sat, the way they constantly scanned the exits, the quiet economy of their movements. I counted them carefully. There were roughly 20 men and women scattered among the bride's guests who carried that same invisible, heavy weight as Mason. Active duty, reserves, and veterans. They were a tribe, my tribe. Throughout the elaborate 5-course meal, as my father made boisterous, self-aggrandizing toasts and Parker soaked up the unearned adulation of the crowd, I noticed something else. Mason was watching. Not just him, but several others at his table. They observed the way my brother snapped his fingers at the waitstaff. They noticed how I was relegated to a small, cramped table near the kitchen's swinging doors, practically out of sight. They saw the relentless microaggressions, the dismissive gestures, the blatant erasure of my presence. I did not look at these 20 Marines as a cavalry waiting to ride to my rescue. I had my heavily highlighted, irrefutable dossier locked securely in the trunk of my car. I possessed the legal and financial ammunition to level my family's fraudulent empire entirely on my own. I required absolutely no saviors to fight my battles. Yet, as the rehearsal dinner wound down and the guests transitioned to the fireside lounge for after-dinner drinks, a strange, unfamiliar sensation settled deeply into my bones. It was the feeling of being accurately perceived. For my entire life, my family had defined me by my utility and my silence. They looked at me and saw a convenient void, a machine built to absorb their burdens. But standing in the shadows of the coastal resort, feeling the quiet, assessing weight of Mason Mercer's gaze from across the room, I knew the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. My parents had meticulously arranged the board for a flawless victory. They believed they controlled every single piece in play, anticipating every move. They had no idea that a massive, silent variable had just been introduced to their perfect social equation. Mason's quiet recognition was a solitary puzzle piece, sitting innocuous and unnoticed on the edge of the table. Neither my mother, nor my father, nor my brother had any inkling that tomorrow, when they finally pushed me to the absolute breaking point, that single piece would become the fulcrum upon which their entire manufactured reality would violently collapse. At exactly 8 o'clock on the morning of the wedding, my phone vibrated against the bathroom counter of my hotel room. The caller ID displayed my father's name. I let it ring for precisely 10 seconds before answering, allowing my heart rate to settle into a slow, measured rhythm. Douglas Perry did not call to wish me a pleasant morning. He ordered me to come up to suite 412 immediately, stating that there were some minor administrative details regarding the estate that needed to be cleared up before the guests began arriving for the early afternoon ceremony. I put on a sharply tailored beige blazer, checked my reflection in the mirror to ensure my expression was completely unreadable, and walked down the carpeted hallway. Suite 412 was the bridal party's overflow room, currently smelling of expensive hairspray, untouched room service pastries, and the sharp tang of nervous sweat. When I pushed the door open, the room was empty except for my mother and father. They were sitting on opposite ends of a plush velvet sofa, positioned perfectly to box me in the moment I took the armchair across from them. Resting in the dead center of the glass coffee table was a single, heavy cream-colored envelope. The flap was unsealed. "Sit down, Addison," my mother said. She was already wearing her mother-of-the-groom gown, a structured sapphire silk creation that made her look like a piece of sharpened artillery. She did not offer me coffee. She did not ask if I had slept well. She simply pointed a manicured finger at the envelope. I took the seat, my posture rigidly straight. I reached forward, pulling the thick cardstock from the envelope. The document was meticulously formatted, bearing the letterhead of a local Carolina law firm. The title at the top read, "Confirmation of Consent for Temporary Transfer of Use." I read the paragraphs quickly, my eyes scanning the legal jargon. It was an exceptionally clever, deeply sinister piece of paperwork. Stripped of its polite legal phrasing, the document was a retroactive waiver. It was a legally binding admission that I was fully aware of the ongoing changes to the Moorhead Sound Trust, and that I enthusiastically consented to relinquishing any immediate claims or injunctions against the property. It was the final, desperate fail-safe they needed to completely sanitize the fraudulent wedding gift. They needed my wet ink signature to ensure the title company would not flag the transaction on Monday morning. My mother did not wait for me to finish reading. She launched her offensive, striking directly at the core of my supposed family obligations. "We need you to sign that right now," Marianne said, her voice dropping into a low, intimate register designed to simulate maternal warmth while delivering a threat. "Parker is nervous enough today. Do not turn the most beautiful day of your brother's life into an awkward, miserable situation. We are handling the estate logistics internally to ensure his future is secure. We expect you to support him." I looked up from the paper. They were deploying their standard psychological warfare. It was the exact same tactic they had used my entire life. Frame their unreasonable demands as basic family decency, and frame my potential refusal as an act of aggressive, selfish sabotage. My father leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, adding the heavy artillery of social panic to the conversation. "The Mercers are incredibly thorough people." "Addison," Douglas said, his jaw tight. "If this paperwork is not completely immaculate by this afternoon, they have the resources to find out the house does not have a clean, undisputed title. If they discover there is friction regarding Parker's financial foundation, the wedding is compromised. Your brother will be utterly humiliated in front of a family that values honor above everything. You cannot do that to him. You just need to sign the consent form so the title company gets the green light." The sheer audacity of the ambush settled over me like a heavy woolen blanket. Sitting in that overly air-conditioned suite, the final, humiliating puzzle piece snapped securely into place. This was the singular reason I had received a wedding invitation. I had not been asked to travel down to South Carolina to witness my brother take his vows. I was not here to be a sister, a daughter, or even a glorified wedding coordinator. I was summoned solely because I was a required signature. They needed my physical presence in a controlled environment where they could corner me, apply massive emotional leverage, and force me to legally authorize my own robbery. I kept my face perfectly blank. I slowly lowered the document back to the glass table. As I shifted in my chair, I subtly slid my right hand into the pocket of my blazer. With a practiced, blind movement, I pressed the side button of my phone, activating the voice recording application I had primed before walking into the room. "I am just trying to understand the urgency," I said, modulating my voice to sound hesitant and slightly intimidated, exactly how they expected me to sound when cornered. "Why does this specific form need to be signed this morning? Can we not handle estate administration next week?" My father let out a harsh, patronizing sigh, entirely convinced that his intellectual superiority was breaking down my resistance. "Because we are handing them the keys during the toast tonight," Douglas snapped, his frustration overriding his caution. "And more importantly, because after the marriage certificate is formally filed, it will be far too late to overturn everything. It becomes a joint marital asset under the new deed. We need the title company's final clearance today, which requires your explicit sign-off on the trust adjustment, so pick up the pen." I felt a cold thrill of victory pulse through my veins. The microphone in my pocket had captured every single syllable of his confession. He had just explicitly admitted, on tape, that the transfer was designed to permanently lock me out of the asset the moment the state recognized the marriage. What my parents did not know was that I possessed a crucial piece of logistical intelligence they had entirely overlooked. At 6 o'clock that morning, while reviewing the vendor timelines, the lead wedding coordinator had complained to me about the officiant's schedule. The state marriage license, the actual legal document that bound Parker and Lydia together under the law, was not being signed at the altar. To preserve the aesthetic flow of the ceremony, the coordinator had scheduled the official signing to take place in a private room at 10 o'clock at night, immediately following the final reception send-off. The legal window to stop this marriage was not closing this afternoon. It was wide open until the very end of the night. I reached down and picked up the expensive cream envelope. I carefully folded the consent form and slid it inside, leaving it completely unsigned. I stood up from the armchair, holding the envelope against my chest. I looked at my mother, then at my father, and forced the corners of my mouth into a soft, yielding smile. It was the exact smile of the compliant, beaten-down daughter they had cultivated for 3 decades. "I understand," I said quietly. "I will hold on to this envelope for now. I am going to go check on the florists. You do not need to worry about me. I will not embarrass the family today." The collective sigh of relief that left their bodies was palpable. My father leaned back against the sofa, the tension draining from his shoulders, while my mother offered a thin, victorious smirk. They had successfully bullied me into submission. They truly believed that my promise not to embarrass the family meant I would quietly forge my own chains and hand over my inheritance for the sake of appearances. They thought the battle was over before a single guest had even arrived. I turned and walked out of suite 412. My boots sinking into the plush corridor carpet. I reached into my pocket and stopped the recording, saving the audio file to a secure cloud server. As I walked toward the elevator, the cold, heavy knot of obligation that had bound me to these people for my entire life finally dissolved. For 35 years, they had relied on my silence. They had used closed doors and private hotel rooms to extract my compliance, terrified of what the world would think if their cruelty was ever exposed to the light. They liked to apply pressure in the dark. They liked to trap me in private rooms where no one could hear the threats. At that exact moment, stepping into the elevator, I made my final tactical decision. If my family enjoyed forcing me into a corner, I was no longer going to fight them in the shadows. I was going to take the envelope, the highlighted bank records, and the recorded confession, and I was going to hand them their absolute truth right under the crystal chandeliers. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for, in front of 120 witnesses. The wedding ceremony commenced at precisely 4 o'clock in the afternoon on a manicured lawn facing the ocean. As the string quartet began to play, I was directed to my assigned seat. I was not placed in the second row, the traditional position for the groom's immediate family. Instead, my designated chair was situated at the absolute farthest edge of the seating arrangement, tucked tightly against the side aisle. I was positioned so far to the periphery that my view of the floral altar was entirely obstructed by a massive stone pillar. Directly behind me were the swinging wooden doors used by the catering staff. Throughout the exchange of the sacred vows, my experience of my brother's wedding was punctuated by the sharp smell of roasted meats, the clattering of dropped silverware, and the frantic, hushed whispers of the waitstaff. I was biologically the sister of the groom, but logistically, I had been classified as part of the venue's background noise. The psychological marginalization continued seamlessly into the golden hour photography session. The hired photographer, a frantic man armed with 3 different cameras, attempted to arrange the Perry family into a cohesive, loving portrait. Every time he positioned me near the center, my mother would suddenly step forward, her hands fluttering with manufactured anxiety. She would insist the lighting was wrong or the symmetry was off. With gentle, physically immovable nudges, Marianne constantly adjusted the formation. I was repeatedly instructed to take a half step back, to angle my body sideways, to stand behind Lydia's cascading bridal bouquet, or to tuck myself behind the broad shoulder of a groomsman. Within 20 minutes, it became violently clear to everyone on the lawn, including the deeply uncomfortable photographer, that my mother was actively orchestrating my visual erasure. She was physically editing me out of the family legacy in real time. When the reception doors finally opened, the grand ballroom was a masterpiece of amber lighting and opulent excess. Parker and Lydia made their grand entrance to a roaring wave of applause. My brother strode into the room like a conquering hero returning from a triumphant campaign, raising his champagne glass to the cheering crowd. Lydia looked radiant, her smile genuine and bright, watching her spin on the dance floor. I felt a sharp pang of profound pity. She was dancing in a dress that cost more than a luxury vehicle, entirely ignorant of the fact that the very ground she was spinning on was financed by fraudulent debt. She did not know about the forged title documents, the desperate bank loans, or the fact that her new husband was effectively bankrupt. She was stepping into a marriage built on a foundation of decaying wood, beautifully painted over with fresh white gloss. Dinner was served, a heavy, extravagant 5-course meal that dragged on for nearly 2 hours. As the plates from the main course were being cleared, the lights dimmed, and the clinking of crystals signaled the beginning of the toasts. Marianne stood up first, taking the silver microphone with the practiced elegance of a seasoned politician. She began her speech with glowing, sentimental praise for her perfect son and his beautiful new bride. But then, as she paced slowly across the polished dance floor, the pivot occurred. She adopted a tone of playful, self-deprecating family humor, but every single syllable was a meticulously crafted, poisoned dart aimed directly at my table. She smiled warmly at the Mercer family and sighed dramatically into the microphone. She told the room that raising 2 distinctly different children was a challenge. She joked that some people are simply born to nurture, to love unconditionally, and to bring warmth into a home. Then, her eyes flicked toward the dark corner where I was seated. Her smile tightened. She added that, conversely, some people are born to turn every minor family dinner into a hostile congressional hearing. A wave of awkward, uncertain laughter rippled through the ballroom. The Mercer side of the room chuckled politely, assuming it was a standard, slightly edgy sibling joke, but the people who knew our family understood the subtext. It was a public branding. My mother was establishing the narrative, right in front of 120 influential guests, that I was the difficult, combative, loveless spinster of the family. Douglas did not let the momentum fade. He took the microphone next, his cheeks flushed with expensive bourbon. He leaned into the stand, adopting a boisterous, masculine posture. He praised Parker for his warm spirit and his incredible ability to build a beautiful home. He spoke about the importance of legacy and generosity. Then, he delivered his own toxic punchline. He looked directly at me, his eyes hard and unyielding, and announced to the crowd that he was incredibly grateful not everyone in the Perry household behaved like a military logistics officer performing a hostile tax audit. The laughter this time was thinner, laced with a distinct undercurrent of discomfort. The public hazing was becoming too prolonged, too specific. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting gracefully on my lap, my face a mask of absolute, unreadable calm. I let the humiliation wash over me, feeling the heat of the spotlight and the collective gaze of the room burning into my skin. Then came the final, devastating maneuver. The trap they had spent the entire weekend setting was finally sprung. Parker stood up from the sweetheart table. He picked up the microphone, his charismatic smile firmly in place. He looked at me, his expression radiating a toxic, manufactured affection. He called for the room's attention, stating that it was time to acknowledge the strongest sister a man could ever ask for. He spoke about how our family was built on profound generosity and unbreakable bonds. He then reached into the breast pocket of his tailored tuxedo jacket and pulled out a pristine ceremonial white envelope. He held it out toward the center of the room, beckoning me with his free hand. He announced, his voice echoing loudly through the state-of-the-art sound system, that it was finally time for his sister to officially present the joint family wedding gift. He told the crowd that the Perry family was formally handing over the keys to a beautiful waterfront estate, and he wanted me, the rock of the family, to be the one to seal the transfer. The entire ballroom went completely silent. 120 heads turned simultaneously in my direction. The spotlight swung rapidly across the room, illuminating my table in a blinding circle of white light. To the old money aristocrats, the distant relatives, and the society friends, it looked like the climax of a beautiful, redemptive family movie. It looked like a brother honoring his fiercely loyal sister by sharing the spotlight during a moment of massive generational generosity. But I knew exactly what it was. It was an execution. They knew I had the unsigned consent form folded inside the blazer pocket resting against my ribs. Parker was standing in front of an audience of military veterans and high society judges, holding an empty ceremonial envelope, demanding that I walk up to the stage, produce the legal waiver, sign away my inheritance with a provided pen, and slide it into his waiting hands. My family had brilliantly weaponized my lifelong silence. They had transformed my deep, ingrained aversion to public drama into a psychological hostage situation. They were absolutely certain that the crushing, suffocating weight of 120 expectant pairs of eyes would terrify me into compliance. They believed that rather than ruin the flawless aesthetic of the reception, rather than expose the ugly, rotting truth to the aristocratic Mercer dynasty, I would simply smile, swallow the financial devastation, and sign my name. They were using the applause of strangers to force a robbery. I took a slow, measured breath. The air in the ballroom felt impossibly thin. I felt the sharp edges of the folded documents resting in my inner pocket. The recorded audio file of my father's confession felt heavy on the smartphone in my purse. I placed my linen napkin on the table. The sound of the polite, encouraging applause began to swell around me, urging me to step into the light and surrender. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping softly against the polished floor. I stood up very slowly, keeping my spine perfectly aligned. I looked at my mother's smug, victorious face. I looked at my father's challenging glare. I looked at Parker, holding the white envelope like a weapon. They had forced me onto this stage. They had built this entire theater just to break me in public. As I stepped away from the table, my cold composure hardening into pure, unyielding steel, I accepted their invitation. I was going to give them the show they had so desperately demanded. I resumed my journey toward the center of the ballroom. The distance between my assigned table in the shadows and the brilliantly illuminated stage felt like a forced march across a hostile landscape. The polite, rhythmic applause from the 120 guests swelled, urging me forward into the trap. Up on the elevated platform, Parker stood beneath the warm, amber spotlights. He held the pristine white envelope out toward me with a sickeningly triumphant smile plastered across his face. My father leaned back in his velvet chair at the head table, a look of profound, arrogant satisfaction settling over his features. My mother was practically glowing with the thrill of a successful ambush. They were absolutely certain the execution was going flawlessly. They were waiting for me to break. I was exactly 10 paces away from the microphone when a sharp, violent sound tore through the elegant atmosphere of the room. It was not a gasp of horror. It was not a shout of protest. It was the distinct, abrasive scrape of heavy wooden chair legs being shoved forcefully backward against the polished floorboards. The noise originated from the cluster of premium tables assigned exclusively to the bride's side of the family. I paused, my combat boots rooting me to the floor. The polite applause instantly faltered and died, replaced by a wave of palpable confusion rippling through the wealthy crowd. Mason Mercer rose to his feet. He did not look like a brother celebrating a joyous union. The polite, restrained social facade he had maintained meticulously throughout the entire weekend was completely gone. In its place was a cold, hardened severity. He stood at full attention, his broad shoulders squared, his posture flawlessly rigid. He looked directly past me, ignoring the bewildered stares of the country club elite. His eyes fixed on my father at the head table with the lethal, unblinking focus of an infantry officer assessing a critical threat. For a fraction of a second, the entire ballroom hung in a fragile state of suspended animation. My mother's victorious smirk froze on her lips. Parker instinctively lowered the envelope a fraction of an inch, his eyes darting toward the Mercer tables. Then, the chain reaction commenced. A second chair scraped harshly against the wood, then a third, then a fifth, then a dozen more. In a rolling but perfectly disciplined wave, 19 other men and women seated around the Mercer family section stood up. They did not verbally coordinate the movement, nor did they look at each other for confirmation. They moved with the synchronized, unspoken instinct forged by years of shared military doctrine. They pushed their chairs aside and stood tall, their hands resting naturally at their sides, their expressions identical masks of stone-cold disapproval. 20 Marines were now standing at attention in the middle of a high-society wedding reception. The silence that violently crashed down upon the ballroom was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating weight, far more terrifying than any theatrical outburst of rage or shouted accusation. There was no chaotic screaming, no dramatic throwing of champagne glasses. It was the terrifying, focused quiet of a military unit closing ranks against an enemy. The society guests, the wealthy investors, and the civilian elite froze in their seats, utterly paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming shift in the room's atmospheric pressure. My family had meticulously designed this public spectacle to make me feel small. They had intended to isolate me beneath the crushing weight of public expectation, using the crowd as a weapon to force my submission. But as those 20 figures stood entirely motionless, forming an impenetrable silent wall of solidarity, the entire geometry of the room inverted violently. Suddenly, looking at the head table, it was Douglas and Marianne Perry who appeared incredibly, pathetically small. Mason did not yell. He did not need to raise his voice. In the absolute graveyard quiet of the ballroom, His baritone carried effortlessly all the way to the stage, striking with the precision of a sniper's bullet. "Mr. Perry," Mason stated, addressing my father directly, his tone entirely devoid of any social respect. "You just spent 10 minutes publicly humiliating the woman who kept 20 Marines alive so they could be sitting in this room today." My father's face instantly drained of all color. The expensive bourbon flush vanished from his cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, sickly white hue. He opened his mouth, but his vocal cords failed him. No sound emerged. The boisterous patriarch, who loved to aggressively dominate corporate boardrooms, was completely neutralized by a single, factual sentence delivered by a man who actually understood the profound weight of life and death. Before Douglas could recover or attempt to formulate a pathetic defense, the movement shifted to the very center of the Mercer tables. Colonel Thomas Mercer, the formidable patriarch of the aristocratic military family my parents so desperately wanted to align with, slowly placed his linen napkin on the table. He stood up. He smoothed the lapels of his custom tuxedo, exuding decades of undeniable command authority. He did not look at my parents. He looked directly at me. "My son is entirely correct," the colonel stated. His voice was a low, rumbling thunder that commanded absolute submission from every single person present. "I have read the after-action reports regarding the supply lines out of that valley. Captain Perry is not a troublemaker. She is not a woman who turns minor inconveniences into battlefields. She is the exact type of person who refuses to surrender when a crisis hits. She is the reason other people survive when the system utterly fails." The colonel finally turned his terrifying gaze toward the head table. The disdain radiating from his eyes was so potent, it could have stripped the gold leaf off the ceiling. "We do not mock that kind of fortitude in our family. We revere it." I turned my head slightly to observe Lydia. The beautiful bride, dressed in hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of imported white silk, was staring blankly at her new husband. The veil of carefully constructed deception had just been violently ripped away. For the very first time all weekend, Lydia was not looking at the charming, visionary entrepreneur my family had aggressively sold to her. She was looking at a terrified man holding an empty envelope, shivering slightly under the devastating glare of her own father and brother. She looked from Parker to Marianne, then to Douglas, her eyes widening with the sudden, horrifying realization of the massive, ugly chasm between the flawless image the Perrys projected and the venomous reality of how they treated their own blood. The balance of power in the room had irrevocably shattered. The grand, expensive stage my parents had built to secure their ascension into the upper echelon of society had just transformed into the site of their absolute social execution. They had gambled everything on the arrogant assumption that nobody in the world would ever stand up for their quiet, utility-driven daughter. They had miscalculated fatally. I felt a strange, profound stillness settle into the very core of my chest. The lifelong psychological conditioning, the deeply ingrained instinct to shrink myself to avoid their displeasure, evaporated completely into the chilled air. I did not burst into tears of relief. I did not fall to my knees in dramatic gratitude toward the men and women standing at attention. The situation did not require messy emotional theatrics. It required absolute, surgical precision. I turned toward the bride's side of the room and gave Mason a single, barely perceptible nod of acknowledgement. He held my gaze for a second, then gave a curt, respectful nod in return. I resumed my walk toward the stage. My steps were perfectly even, my posture flawless. I reached the center of the polished dance floor and stepped up onto the slight elevation where my brother was standing. Parker looked exactly like a cornered animal. The charismatic, golden boy glow had entirely vanished from his face. A bead of nervous sweat trickled down his temple, catching the harsh glare of the spotlight. His hand trembled so violently that the edges of the pristine white envelope vibrated visibly. He tried to offer me a pleading, desperate look, his eyes silently begging me to save him from the catastrophic humiliation unfolding before his new in-laws. I did not look at the envelope. I did not acknowledge his panic. I reached out and smoothly slid the silver microphone from his shaking grip. The cold metal felt incredibly grounding against my palm. I turned away from my brother to face the room. 120 wealthy guests, 20 standing Marines, and a thoroughly dismantled family stared back at me in breathless, terrified anticipation. The absolute calm radiating from my posture was far more intimidating than if I had been screaming in a blind rage. They had built this stage. They had turned on the spotlights, and they had arrogantly demanded a performance. Now they were going to get one. I stood at the center of the stage, the heavy silver microphone resting lightly in my grip. The silence in the ballroom was so absolute that I could hear the faint, rhythmic lapping of the ocean waves against the stone terrace outside. I looked out at the 20 Marines who were still standing at rigid attention. I appreciated their intervention, I truly did, but I needed to make one thing unequivocally clear before the night proceeded any further. "Thank you, Colonel Mercer." "Thank you, Mason," I said, my voice projecting smoothly through the state-of-the-art sound system, steady and completely devoid of any trembling. "I am deeply grateful for your respect, but I do not need anyone in this room to rescue my honor tonight. My honor, and my inherent worth, have never once depended on my family's deeply distorted perception of who I am." I turned my attention back to the man standing frozen beside me. Parker looked as though the polished wooden floorboards were about to swallow him whole. I reached out and plucked the pristine white envelope from his trembling fingers. He did not resist. His grip had completely failed him. "My brother just told you all that he is receiving a magnificent wedding gift," I continued, holding the envelope up high so the bright spotlights caught the expensive cream paper. I looked directly at the wedding planner standing near the exit, then at Lydia, and finally at Colonel Mercer. A beautiful waterfront cottage, a generational legacy to start his new life. What he failed to mention is the required administrative step. He needs me to sign this. I broke the wax seal, pulled out the legal waiver they had tried to force on me that morning in the suite, and unfolded it. I held the document steady, facing the crowd. "This is a legally binding confirmation of consent," I explained, my tone shifting into the clinical, authoritative cadence I utilized during corporate fraud audits. "It is a waiver designed to retroactively authorize the transfer of a property that currently sits in a generation-skipping trust established by our late grandmother, a trust that mandates a strict 50-50 split between Parker and myself." A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the bride's side of the room. I did not pause to let the shock settle. I reached into the structured leather tote bag I had placed at the foot of the stage stairs. I pulled out the heavy manila folder I had painstakingly assembled with Naomi Voss. "I do not deal in emotion," I stated calmly, opening the folder and extracting the first stack of highlighted papers. "I deal in contracts, I deal in ledgers, and I deal in irrefutable facts." I held up the first document. "This is a copy of the original trust agreement." I dropped it onto the small cocktail table next to the microphone stand. I pulled out the next packet. "This is a copy of a fraudulent mortgage application. 3 weeks ago, my parents used an outdated, deeply restricted military deployment power of attorney to bypass the trust. They forged my consent to secure a massive home equity line of credit against my half of the estate." The color completely drained from Lydia's face. She took a staggering step backward, her hands flying to her mouth in horror. I kept going, pulling out the bank records. "These are the wire transfer histories. The money pulled from my inheritance did not go into a savings account for the newlyweds. It went directly to this resort. It paid for the imported orchids on your tables. It paid for the 5-course dinner you just consumed. It paid for the 12-piece band. A significant portion of this entire luxury wedding is currently being financed by stolen equity." I dropped the bank statements onto the table. The sound of the heavy paper slapping against the wood echoed like a gunshot. "And finally," I said, holding up the unexecuted quitclaim deed, "this is the paperwork preparing to transfer the heavily indebted cottage entirely into the names of Parker and Lydia, effectively erasing my legal existence from the property altogether. Therefore, to the 120 guests gathered here tonight, I must clarify the situation. The grand wedding gift my brother was about to receive does not belong entirely to the Perry family to give. And as of this morning, all transactions regarding the Moorhead Sound estate are frozen by a pending legal injunction. Lydia turned slowly to Parker. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the dead silence of the ballroom, it carried a devastating weight. "Parker, did you know about this? Tell me you did not know they stole from your sister to pay for our wedding." Parker swallowed hard. His eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. He raised his hands in a placating, desperate gesture. "Lydia, sweetheart, I swear to you, I had absolutely no idea. Mom and Dad handled all the finances. I thought it was just a straight family gift." I did not know any of the specific details. He was lying. It was the exact same cowardly reflex he had utilized his entire life, hiding behind our parents when the consequences of his actions finally caught up to him. I did not raise my voice. I did not call him a liar. I simply reached back into the manila folder and pulled out a single sheet of printed email correspondence. "I am not going to argue with you, Parker," I said smoothly. "I am just going to read your own words. An email sent from your account to our father, dated 2 months ago, discussing the risk of utilizing the power of attorney." I held the paper up to the light and read the exact phrasing aloud, articulating every single syllable with lethal clarity. "You wrote, and I quote, 'We do not need to worry. She will not ruin it. Addison lives by principles, and her principle is to always save face for the family,' unquote." The entire room heard it. The naked, undeniable complicity in his own written words destroyed any remaining illusion of his innocence. He had not just been a passive beneficiary. He had actively calculated my breaking point. "Addison, enough!" my father bellowed, suddenly lunging forward from the head table. His face was contorted into a mask of pure, desperate rage. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "Shut your mouth right now! This is a private family matter. You are entirely out of line bringing our private financial discussions into a public forum. Actually, Douglas, it ceased being a private family matter the moment you committed mortgage fraud." The voice did not belong to me. It came from the shadows near the back of the ballroom. Naomi Voss stepped forward into the ambient light. She was dressed impeccably in a charcoal suit, looking exactly like the apex predator she was in the courtroom. I had quietly added her to the guest list as my +1, seating her far away from the family tables so she could observe the proceedings unnoticed. Naomi walked calmly toward the front of the room, her designer heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. She stopped a few feet from my father's table. "My name is Naomi Voss," she announced to the stunned crowd, her voice carrying the unmistakable, icy authority of a senior litigator. "I am legal counsel for Addison. I can confirm that the documents presented here are entirely authentic. We have thoroughly reviewed the chain of title and the financial disclosures. There is clear documented evidence of power of attorney abuse, breach of fiduciary duty, and substantial property fraud. This is not a family squabble over a misunderstanding. This is a severe criminal liability." My father practically collapsed back into his chair, his bluster completely evaporating under the terrifying threat of federal prosecution. My mother, however, changed her tactics. The arrogant, untouchable matriarch vanished. Marianne suddenly rushed forward, stopping just at the edge of the stage. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, tears beginning to spill over her perfectly applied makeup. It was a masterful, desperate pivot to playing the ultimate victim. "Addison, please," Marianne begged, her voice cracking with manufactured anguish. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest. "I am begging you. Look at your brother. Look at Lydia. Please, do not do this. Do not destroy your brother's happiness on his wedding day. We are family." I looked down at the woman who had spent 35 years treating me like a disposable asset. I looked at the tears rolling down her cheeks and felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no hesitation. Just a profound, liberating emptiness. I leaned closer to the microphone. I looked directly into her eyes and delivered the words I had swallowed. suppressed, and choked on for my entire existence. "I am not destroying anything, Mother," I said, my voice dropping to a low, resonant calm that chilled the air. "You built a house of cards on top of a massive lie, and you used my name to secure the foundation. I am simply refusing to continue funding your illusion." I stepped back from the microphone stand. I left the folder of evidence sitting open on the cocktail table, a permanent, undeniable monument to their deceit. The atmospheric shift in the grand ballroom was absolute and irrevocable. Not a single person in that room was looking at me as the bitter, jealous sister who ruined a magical evening. The whispering had stopped. The judgmental stares had vanished. Instead, 120 pairs of eyes were fixed entirely on the Perry family. They looked at my father, shrinking pathetically in his seat. They looked at my mother, whose theatrical tears were failing to elicit a single ounce of sympathy from the crowd. They looked at my brother, fully exposed as a cowardly fraud. The high society guests and the military veterans were united in their disgust. They saw exactly what my family truly was. They saw a group of people who had shamelessly used their own daughter as a human shield and an open wallet, entirely confident that they could crush her into silence. They had demanded a performance. They had forced me onto the stage, and I had just burned their entire theater to the absolute ground. Lydia stepped out from the paralyzing shock holding the room hostage. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She walked directly to the small cocktail table on the stage and picked up the open manila folder. Her eyes scanned the highlighted bank routing numbers, the forged signatures, and the printed email thread. The dry rustle of the heavy paper was the only sound echoing in the cavernous, opulent space. She turned slowly to face my brother. "Parker," she said, her voice eerily calm, vibrating with a terrifying clarity. "I need you to answer one single question. If Addison had submitted to your pressure today, if she had signed that waiver this morning and handed you the envelope tonight, what was your plan? Were you ever going to tell me the truth? After we signed the marriage license tonight, were you going to confess that my perfect wedding gift was stolen from your sister?" Parker opened his mouth, but no words materialized. The charismatic, silver-tongued entrepreneur was completely paralyzed. He looked at our mother for a lifeline, but Marianne was too busy staring at the floor, her carefully constructed social empire crumbling into dust around her designer shoes. Parker looked back at Lydia. He stayed completely silent. 1 second passed, then 2, then 5. That agonizing, stretching silence was the heaviest, most damning confession of the entire evening. Lydia nodded slowly, accepting the bitter, undeniable reality. She reached for her left hand. With a smooth, deliberate motion, she slid the heavy platinum engagement ring off her finger. She walked over to the grand entrance where the velvet-lined guest registry book sat on a high pedestal table. She placed the glittering diamond right in the center of the open pages. "I will not be joining you in the private suite at 10 o'clock tonight," Lydia announced, her voice ringing out over the silent crowd. "I am not signing a state marriage license to bind my life to a man who builds his foundation on financial fraud and absolute cowardice. We are done." Before my parents could launch a desperate, face-saving plea, Colonel Thomas Mercer was already at his daughter's side. He placed a steady, protective hand on Lydia's shoulder and guided her gently toward the grand double doors. He stopped for a fraction of a second and locked eyes with Mason. The silent command was instantly understood. The 20 Marines who had been standing at rigid attention moved with flawless tactical precision. They did not draw weapons or raise their fists, but their unified movement created an impenetrable human barrier between the Mercer family guests and the head table. Mason looked directly at my father and warned him not to take a single step toward Lydia, and he explicitly ordered the Perry family to maintain a wide, respectful distance from me. The bride's side of the ballroom began a swift, remarkably orderly evacuation, leaving behind untouched crystal champagne glasses and ruined illusions. Once the heavy wooden doors clicked shut, behind the last departing Mercer guest, the suffocating tension in the room snapped. Douglas Perry erupted. Stripped of his wealthy, aristocratic audience. His polished patriarch persona disintegrated entirely. He slammed his fists onto the head table, sending heavy silver cutlery clattering to the floor. He pointed a shaking, furious finger at me and roared that I had maliciously destroyed my brother's future. He screamed that I was a vindictive, heartless woman who had ruined the family name forever. His rage had absolutely zero effect on me. I stood my ground, watching his tantrum with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction. The remaining guests, my parents' country club friends and distant relatives, were not nodding in agreement with him. They were looking at their shoes, shifting uncomfortably, deeply embarrassed to be associated with him. They had seen the irrefutable evidence. They knew exactly who had orchestrated this catastrophic collapse. I did not shout back. I walked down the stage steps and stopped a few feet from where my father was fuming. I delivered my final, non-negotiable terms. "You have exactly 30 days, I stated, my voice cutting through his lingering shouts like a sharpened blade. "You will fully reimburse the stolen funds to the trust account, and you will completely close the fraudulent line of credit. I do not care how you secure the capital. You can sell your primary residence, you can liquidate your retirement portfolios, or you can sell your secondary investment property down in Boca Raton. But if that trust is not made entirely whole by the end of next month, Naomi will file the civil litigation paperwork, and she will formally hand this massive dossier over to the federal prosecutor's office for wire fraud and forgery investigations." Parker finally lost his glossy veneer. His tailored tuxedo suddenly looked like a cheap, ill-fitting costume. He practically lunged forward, his face twisted in a pathetic, ugly sneer. He yelled that I had always been intensely jealous of him. He screamed that I hated his light, I hated his charm, and I was just bitter because our parents had always loved him more. It was the desperate, flailing defense of a deeply spoiled child who had finally run out of other people's money to burn. Nobody in the room believed his tired, fabricated narrative anymore. The illusion of the golden boy was officially dead. I looked at him, feeling nothing but a profound, chilling indifference. I turned my back on my family, retrieved my coat, and walked out of the resort into the cool coastal night air. 8 months have passed since that evening in South Carolina. The fallout was swift and legally brutal. Facing the terrifying reality of federal prison time, Douglas and Marianne were forced to rapidly liquidate their assets. They sold their prized investment properties at a massive loss to meet my 30-day deadline and avoid prosecution. Their social standing within their elite circles evaporated overnight. High society does not invite confirmed embezzlers to charity galas. Parker did not get a miraculous second chance at becoming a visionary entrepreneur. He packed up his expensive loft and moved back into his childhood bedroom in Wilmington. He currently works a standard 40-hour-a-week job with a fixed, unremarkable salary for a mid-tier event production company. The pampered genius complex has been entirely stripped away by the harsh reality of manual labor and middle management. As for the Moorhead Sound cottage, the legal title is now impeccably clean and sits solely in my name. I spent the last several months overseeing a quiet, thorough renovation of the property. I transformed the waterfront house into a peaceful, secluded retreat. I go down there to read, to watch the tide roll in, and occasionally, I invite former military families to stay for long, restful weekends. My actions were never about orchestrating a loud, theatrical vengeance. It was never about making them suffer just for the sake of suffering. It was a final, undeniable assertion of my own boundaries. It was the exact moment I permanently closed the door on their polite cruelty, ensuring that from that day forward, nothing belonging to me, not my money, not my name, and certainly not my peace, would ever be consumed in the name of their toxic family loyalty again. Thank you for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are listening to this story from. So please leave a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by pressing the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by even more people.